Imagine giving everything you have to raise two children. You sacrifice your youth, your savings, and your dreams to make sure they succeed. And one of them does. He becomes wealthy, respected, and untouchable. The other struggles just to keep the lights on. But what happens when the person who gave them life is suddenly fighting for their own? When the doctor hands you a diagnosis that stops your heart, and the only thing standing between you and survival is a $3,500 surgery. He said no. You assume the son who has everything will step up. You assume wrong. This is the story of how my successful son looked me in the eye and refused to spare $3,500 for my cancer surgery, and how my struggling daughter, who had nothing, ended up giving me absolutely everything. To understand how a family breaks, you first have to understand how it was built. My son, David, was always the golden child, sharp, ambitious, and ruthless. I worked double shifts just to pay for his college tuition. I wore the same winter coat for 7 years so he could have the laptop he needed for his business degree. And it paid off. By the time he was 30, David was a millionaire. He traded our modest neighborhood for a gated community and our Sunday dinners for networking galas. Then there was Sarah, my sweet, resilient Sarah. She didn't have David's ruthless ambition. She chose a life of service, working as a teaching assistant. She was a single mother, constantly stressed about rent, but always the first to call and check on me. David sent expensive, impersonal gifts for the holidays. Sarah came over and fixed my leaky faucet. We were navigating our separate lives until a Tuesday afternoon in October changed everything. The diagnosis was swift, and the reality was brutal. Cancer. Aggressive, but treatable. The catch? My insurance wouldn't cover the full cost of the specialized surgery I needed immediately. The out-of-pocket gap was exactly $3,500. To someone like David, it was the cost of a weekend getaway. To Sarah, it was a mountain she couldn't climb, and to me, it was the price of my life. No mother ever wants to become a burden to her children. For 3 days after the diagnosis, I sat in silence. I calculated my meager savings. I looked at predatory payday loans. I even considered selling the wedding ring my late husband gave me, but pawnbrokers offered pennies on the dollar. I was trapped. Finally, I did the one thing I swore I'd never do. I drove across town to David's firm. Walking into his glass and steel office building felt like stepping into a different universe. Everyone was moving with purpose, dressed in suits that cost more than my car. I sat in his waiting room for 45 minutes. His receptionist, a polite young woman who wouldn't meet my eyes, kept offering me sparkling water while I sat there, clutching my medical file, feeling smaller by the second. When I was finally ushered in, David didn't stand up to hug me. He gestured to the leather chair across from his desk and checked his watch. "I've got a hard stop in 10 minutes, Mom. What's going on?" I didn't waste time. I laid it out. The cancer, the urgency, the insurance shortfall. I slid the itemized hospital bill across his pristine desk. I watched his eyes, scan the bottom line, $3,500. I expected shock. I expected him to reach for his checkbook. Instead, he leaned back, steepled his fingers, and sighed. He didn't say he couldn't afford it. We both knew he could. Instead, he gave me a lecture on financial literacy. "Mom," he said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you know all my capital is tied up in the new commercial real estate venture. Liquidity is tight this quarter. Besides, if I just hand you the cash, it sets a bad precedent. Have you looked into setting up a payment plan with the billing department?" You really should have planned better for medical emergencies." I sat there, stunned. A bad precedent? Planning better? I wanted to scream that my medical emergency fund went toward his Ivy League tuition. I wanted to remind him of the nights I went hungry so he could have hot meals. But the words caught in my throat. The sheer indignity of it suffocated me. He slid the paper back across the desk. "Let me know what the billing department says," he offered, already turning his attention back to his glowing screens. I didn't say goodbye. I walked out of that glass building and into the cold afternoon air, unable to breathe. It wasn't just the fear of the cancer anymore. It was the crushing weight of betrayal. The realization that the son I had poured my entire soul into had weighed my life against his quarterly liquidity and decided I wasn't worth the investment. I sat in my beat-up sedan and wept until my lungs burned. I was out of options, out of time, and completely alone. Or so I thought. I didn't plan on telling Sarah. She was already working as a teaching assistant by day and picking up waitress shifts by night, just to keep clothes on her 6-year-old daughter's back. How could I add the weight of my mortality to her fragile shoulders? But mothers and daughters share an invisible tether. When she came over that evening to drop off some leftover casserole, she took one look at my eyes and knew. She didn't ask how I was, she asked what happened. I broke down. I told her about the diagnosis. I told her about the $3,500 gap. And, to my deepest shame, I told her about my visit to David's office. Sarah didn't offer a lecture on financial literacy. She didn't check her watch. She just squeezed my hands, her eyes fiercely locked onto mine, and said 5 words that I will remember until my last breath. "We are going to fix this." It's a strange, heartbreaking paradox. How can 2 children, raised in the exact same home, by the exact same mother, turn out so fundamentally different? Psychologists and sociologists have actually studied this. They call it the wealth-empathy gap. Research repeatedly shows that as people acquire immense wealth and power, their reliance on others decreases. They don't need a community to survive, so their brain's capacity for empathy literally begins to dull. To David, my cancer wasn't a human tragedy. It was a logistical inconvenience, a bad investment. But for people like Sarah, who live on the margins, community is survival. Empathy isn't a luxury, it's a daily necessity. Her lack of money hadn't hardened her heart. It had kept it painfully, beautifully open. Sarah didn't have $3,500. She barely had $350. But while David had liquidity tied up in commercial real estate, Sarah had grit. Over the next 2 weeks, I watched my daughter dismantle her life to save mine. She sold the car she needed to get to work, opting to take a 2-hour bus ride instead. She pawned her grandmother's locket. She took on a 3rd job doing overnight data entry. I begged her to stop. I told her I couldn't bear to watch her destroy her own fragile foundation for me. But she just looked at me with those tired, relentless eyes. "Mom," she said, "you sold your future to give me and David a life. This isn't a sacrifice. It's my turn." Society conditions us to measure a person's success by their tax bracket. We look at people like David, with their sprawling estates and diversified portfolios, and we applaud them. We assume that because their bank accounts are full, their character must be too. But watching Sarah exhaust herself to the bone for me shattered that illusion forever. There is a profound difference between financial wealth and relational wealth. David was a billionaire in currency, but bankrupt in humanity. He had built a fortress of money to protect himself from the messy, inconvenient realities of loving other people. Sarah, on the other hand, was financially impoverished but relationally invincible. She understood something David never will. Money is a tool, but love is an action. Love isn't sending a polite holiday card. Love is selling your car so your mother doesn't have to die. 4 days before my scheduled operation, the deadline to pay the out-of-pocket gap arrived. I stood at the billing counter, my stomach tied in agonizing knots, fully prepared to be turned away. Then Sarah walked up beside me. She looked exhausted. There were dark circles under her eyes, and her hands shook slightly as she reached into her worn-out tote bag. She pulled out a thick white envelope and placed it on the counter. The billing clerk opened it. Inside was a cashier's check, mixed with a stack of crumpled $20 and $50 bills. It was the exact amount, $3,500. Every cent accounted for, every cent a testament to my daughter's blood, sweat, and tears. I collapsed into her arms right there in the lobby. I didn't just cry because my life was saved. I cried because I realized I had spent my entire life being proud of the wrong child. I had worshipped David's shiny trophies, completely blind to the fact that Sarah possessed a heart of absolute gold. The surgery was a success. When I finally woke up from the anesthesia, the room was dim and quiet. I turned my head. There, asleep in an uncomfortable plastic hospital chair, was Sarah. She was wearing the same sweater she'd worn for 3 days, her head resting awkwardly against the wall. She had stayed through the entire 7-hour procedure. Then, my phone buzzed on the bedside table. A text message. It read, "Hey Mom, assuming the surgery went well, sent some flowers to the room. Super swamped with this merger. We'll try to call next week. Get well soon." And a generic bouquet of expensive orchids arrived an hour later, clearly ordered by his assistant. Performative love, checking a box. In that quiet hospital room, looking at the contrast between the daughter snoring softly in a plastic chair and the cold, glowing text from the son who couldn't be bothered, I experienced a violent shift in perspective. You see, trauma doesn't just break you down. Sometimes it clears your vision. It strips away the polite fiction of family duty and shows you exactly who people are. It has been 2 years since the surgery. Today, I am entirely cancer-free. But healing from the disease was only half the battle. Healing from the heartbreak took longer. When I was finally back on my feet, I made a decision that shocked the rest of our extended family. But to me, it was the only logical step left to take. I called my lawyer. I completely rewrote my will and restructured my modest estate. I signed my house, the one I had worked my entire life to pay off, over to Sarah. Every penny of my remaining savings, my life insurance policy, everything. When David found out, he was furious. He called me, outraged, demanding to know why I was punishing his success. He actually used the word entitled. I didn't yell, I didn't cry, I simply replied with the language he understood best. I told him, "David, it's just basic financial literacy. You told me you didn't want to set a bad precedent by bailing out family. I'm just following your lead. You didn't invest in my survival, so you don't get a return on my legacy." I hung up. I haven't spoken to him since. Some people might say I'm being harsh, but I realize something profound. DNA makes you relatives, but loyalty makes you family. David was a relative. Sarah was my family. We spend so much of our lives chasing the approval of the successful people in our orbit. We excuse their coldness because of their status. We let them treat us like transactions because we are blinded by their trophies. Stop. Stop breaking your back for people who wouldn't cross the street to pull you out of a fire. Look around you. Look at the people in your life who show up when there is absolutely nothing in it for them. The ones who sit in uncomfortable plastic chairs while you bleed. The ones who empty their empty pockets to make sure you survive. That is where your wealth is. Protect those people, honor them, and never, ever take them for granted. Now, I want to hear from you. Was I right to cut David out of the will, or do you think I went too far? Have you ever experienced the wealth-empathy gap in your own family, where the person with the most gave the absolute least? Drop your story in the comments below right now. I read every single one, and I know someone out there needs to hear that they aren't alone in this. If this story resonated with you, hit that like button. It tells the algorithm to share this message with people who might be struggling with toxic family dynamics right now. And if you haven't already, click subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a story. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your empathy. And remember, true wealth isn't what's in your bank account. It's who is sitting next to your hospital bed.